Chapter 13. Blaine. Blaine couldn't believe the hideousness of the monstrosity the truck dropped off. The container was huge and gray and ugly. "This won't stay long, right?" Kenzi rolled her eyes and shook her head. "No, just long enough for us to load up all the furniture and get the floors redone. Then we'll move the stuff we're keeping back in, and this bad boy," she banged on the side, sending a hollow metallic sound through the air, "will go away." "Good, let's get started." He wasn't sure what was bothering him so much about the storage container, but something about the sight of it just rubbed a nerve. Kenzi nodded and led the way back into the cabin. "Let's load the furniture first, and then we can look at packing up some of the smaller items." Hefting the 2 couches was not an easy feat, but Blaine was impressed that Kenzi held her own, and though beads of sweat broke out on her forehead and trickled down the side of her face, she did not give up. He was able to grab the chair by himself, leaving her the coffee table. It wasn't extremely large, so he figured she could muscle it out herself. As he placed the chair in the container, though, he realized Kenzi wasn't behind him. Had she had trouble with the table after all? Or had she tripped and injured herself? The thought spurred him into action, and he burst out of the container to scoop her up. But she was not on the ground, nor was she injured inside the cabin. Instead, he found her rooted to the spot in the center of the room. The table was on its side as if she had lifted it and then had to set it back down. But that wasn't what held his attention. The faded piece of newspaper she held in her hand was what held his attention, and hers too, as she didn't even look up when he entered. In fact, it wasn't until he was only a few feet from her that she seemed to realize he was there. Her eyes lifted to his, and they were filled with sadness, and he knew. He knew what the paper in her hand said. He knew she had read it, and he knew that she would never look at him the same way again. He'd seen the same sadness in everyone's eyes after the accident. It had been in his father's eyes when he told Blaine about the divorce, and in his mother's eyes when she moved them from their house. He had never wanted to see it in Kenzi's eyes, and now it would always be there. "Blaine," it was all she could seem to manage. Emotion strangled her voice, and pity flowed from her gaze. "Don't," he said, snapping the paper from her. "Don't say you're sorry. Don't say it wasn't my fault." He could feel the anger boiling inside him. The red-hot anger he had buried for years and successfully kept down was now clawing up his throat and demanding to be let out. "Is this why you've never had a relationship? Why you think you can't connect?" She was probably asking out of curiosity and concern, but that didn't matter to Blaine. "I said don't. I don't want to talk about it. In fact, I don't think this was a good idea." His voice came out in a growl, much harsher than he meant it to be, but he seemed unable to tame the fire burning through him. "This?" Confusion contorted her pretty features, and then her face shifted, hardened. "Do you mean me decorating the cabin, or do you mean us?" Blaine could hear the hurt in her voice, see it written all over her face, but he couldn't take back his words. He had known coming back here was a mistake. He should have forfeited the inheritance and let the lawyer deal with it, or left the cabin the way it was and put it up for sale himself. Bringing Kenzi here had been a mistake, and getting involved with her... His thought trailed off as his fists balled at his side. He had known better. Maybe both? He regretted the words as soon as he said them. They cut her in a way a knife never could. He saw her flinch, saw her jaw clench and her eyes tear up. Then he saw her grab her bag and walk out of the door and out of his life. Blaine sank to the floor and stared at the faded newspaper story. Would he ever get past this? Kenzi. Tears blurred Kenzi's vision as she drove. She should have known better. No, she did know better. There was a reason her father always said to keep work and play separated. But how could she have known Blaine would blow up at her like that? She'd had no idea what the paper was when it fluttered out of the table, and her heart had broken for Blaine as she read the story. No wonder he had trouble connecting emotionally. No wonder he hid behind so many walls. But why push her away now that she knew? That was what hurt the most. She'd thought they were building something they could share, but he'd only been pretending. Just like Brian, just like Jeff. Why did she always seem to fall for guys who weren't able to commit? Even worse, what was she going to do now? She'd have to give back the rest of the money Blaine had paid her. She couldn't keep it, and she had no other jobs lined up. The other jobs she had applied for still hadn't called. Maybe she didn't have what it took to be a designer. Maybe the job redoing the center had been offered out of pity from the team. They'd seen her as this pretty girl in her mid-20s who hadn't known what she wanted out of life, and they'd thrown her a bone. Maybe she was destined to go through life without a real talent, with only a pretty face. All the memories of middle school, junior high, and later of Jeff flooded her mind. "Stop it!" She said the words aloud as she banged on the steering wheel. "This is Blaine's issue, not yours." The words were easy to say, but a lot harder to believe. Ever since the accident with Brian and the teasing in junior high, her confidence had been shot. Then she'd reached high school and changed her image. She'd lost weight, discovered fashion, and met Jeff. And she'd thought Jeff really cared for her. But then he dumped her after homecoming and told her he'd only been seeing her to be assured the crown. Kenzi had told no one, not even Shelby. It had been too embarrassing, so instead she'd put on a good front and claimed they had a fight. It had worked, on the outside, but inside she was still that preteen girl looking for acceptance, for love, and not finding it. She didn't even bother to warn Shelby she was coming. Kenzi knew she would be at home working on wedding plans. Her tears waited until she knocked on Shelby's door. But when the door opened and she saw the look of concern on her friend's face, she could hold them back no longer. "What's wrong?" Shelby led her inside and to the couch. Kenzi shook her head as the tears flowed down her face. She couldn't form words yet. Emotions clenched her throat, blocking any sound other than sobs. Shelby placed her arm around Kenzi and let her cry. She seemed to know that's what she needed most. When the tears finally slowed and her throat loosened up, Kenzi lifted her head to look at Shelby. "I think I just got fired." Shelby's eyes widened. "What? You must be mistaken. Surely he didn't fire you." Kenzi shook her head. "He told me he didn't think it was a good idea. I asked him if he meant hiring me or dating me, and he said both." Confusion covered Shelby's face. "That makes no sense. I thought things were going well." "They were, and then I found something I don't think I was supposed to see. We were moving furniture out in order to take out the old flooring, and when I picked up a table, a newspaper clipping fell out. I didn't know what it was, or I never would have read it." "I don't understand. What was in the newspaper clipping?" Kenzi took a deep, shuddering breath. "The death of his brother,"